Pleased to introduce Mike Lightowler, Global Brand Director, Respiratory Franchise at Novartis, to talk today, or tell us a story about storytelling. So welcome.
Several stories. Thanks very much for everyone coming back for coffee, but thanks very much to the organisers for inviting me here. It's great to be here and talk about storytelling. So this is going to be a bit of a different part of the day. So you're not going to hear anything about clicks. You're not going to hear any digital things. There's no platforms. In fact, you don't need any electricity at all. So this is going to be completely different. But I do think it fundamentally fits back into lots of the things that have been talked about today, and I'm sure you're going to talk about over the rest of the course. So I feel a little bit like an imposter here, because I'm not talking about digital pieces, but I'm not also talking about social media or any of those kinds of things. But the only thing I can say that relates to that is this whole thing around. Actually, I like the title, storytelling blogger. That's fantastic. I'm going to change my business cards, because I am a global brand director in respiratory in Novartis. I look after a couple of brands in phase 3. We do spend a lot of our time thinking about how we're going to shape the market, all the things, all the marketing pieces that you're used to us thinking about. But more importantly, in my other side of life, my evening life, I think about communications. And that really is the relevance of what I want to talk to you about today. How we communicate, the fundamentals of communication. Is the clicker around somewhere? Is it on the podium? Yeah. So this whole thing about storytelling is my own personal social media experiment. So I think this is kind of almost the end, and you can tell me whether this is the end or not after the presentation. The end of my experience. I wanted to get into social media. I wanted to understand it from my own standpoint. So I started writing a blog about storytelling, which I was very interested in. And I'm going to give you maybe the first 2 years of the sorts of things I've been thinking about, and all of this stuff, as you'll see, is on the blog site. You'll see the blog site at the end, and you'll have the slides. So it's all free. It's all available. You can use it as you want. I got very interested in stories because, like most marketeers, I was thinking very deeply about the words that we use. And you're going to hear a couple of things as we go through. I'm very interested in the title. What makes your customers tick? What do we mean by tick? In fact, the actual title that they wanted me to speak about was storytelling is a key weapon in your arsenal. Weapon and arsenal. I think they're really interesting ones. I left those out because they were far too military for me. So is this working? Yeah. So I think we've fundamentally got a marketing problem that I've been very interested in trying to find a solution for. Very interested about why people don't listen to you, why people don't do the things that you expect them to do. Put all these programs in place, whether it's digital or print or other things, and you get a response, but it's often not the thing that you expected them to do. Why is it? And I think fundamentally it's because people don't understand you. Don't understand me as a marketeer, because I don't think we fully understand them. So I think that's a lot about what you've been listening to today is about how to give information to people. A lot about listening, I heard that a lot. But I didn't hear fundamentally about understanding. And that's really what I'm most interested in. Give you a second. Shout out when you know the story. Got to be vocal here as well. What's the story? Yours. You have to be quicker. Snow White. Okay, really easy ones. Point of these is, in a few sentences, we got the whole film, we got the whole idea, you've got the whole construct of the idea, you know all the people, you know all the interactions, and you know how it plays out. Key thing is, can you tell your brand story, your digital story, the thing that you want to get across in such a simple way? I think it's really interesting that the film genre can do this. They can really get to the crux of a story very quickly. And so there's something that was a great fascination. How can people get complex things like stories so easily? And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about small, simple stories. and the relevance of how they fit in. And then I want to talk about the Story Manifesto, which is a kind of a checklist that I've put together and take you through most of the elements of that. Fundamentals, I think, of what in our industry storytelling can be about, how we can check it, how we can utilize it, and make it across platforms. And eventually I'm going to talk about transmedia storytelling, just a couple of pieces about that, and talk about how digital space may fit in with that. So small, simple stories sell. We got very interested in the way that people picked up on brands, how you communicate, how you build a brand from scratch, and the stories that are ingrained inside that. We looked at it across the board, across several different projects, and we've started to find, at least in the work that I was doing, that there were key moments, there were brand moments where your brand became extremely understandable if you used certain language and certain words. And so I think as you go through finding those stories, what makes your customers tick? I'll go back to that. Tick, I think, is a very interesting word because it talks about movement and time. So I think when you start to think about the words that people use and you really look deeply, I'm going to talk about how I've started to look at how you can get closer into the minds of customers or consumers or payers or physicians. Actually, it doesn't matter. The people that you want to talk to, how you can understand them and probably talk to them with more relevance. But fundamentally, how can you talk to them and so that they can understand let's face it, pharmaceuticals can be a very complicated environment to work in. We talked about medical education here, and then all of the scientific evidence, all the diagrams, everything that we want to get across. Maybe it's biologic, maybe it's another part of a complicated therapy area. We want to give complicated information in a very simple way. We want to have things that stick, that people remember. And if you think about it, when you go home, when you go and talk after this, in the breaks, you've all been telling small stories. You remember things by little stories that you tell, that you pass on. And that, of course, fundamentally is what we want to do. We want to create this customer word of mouth. We want people to be able to understand us very quickly so we don't have to spend, we talked a lot about ROI, a lot of money because people take a long time to be able to understand us. If we can find a way to crack through that, if there's a code that helps unlock the way into your prospect's mind and get that information that you want to get in a relevant way and understandable, and that can be passed on, then I think you've hit some small stories. So I'm going to give one example that I did work on in Novartis, and Celia was part of the team that worked on this when she was working at Novartis before she got an international stellar career and started traveling the world as a patient ambassador. For those of you that don't know, this Cubicin is a Cubist product in the US, but elsewhere in the world, Novartis has this. And we started down this journey of trying to find out, you can imagine the sort of the phone call. Maybe I'll just wind back a bit. So my boss is on the phone and saying, I've got a new challenge for you. We'd like you to take on a new brand. Great. That's fantastic. Tell me a little bit more about it. Well, it's a product that is already launched. We've taken it on from another company, but the marketing and the campaign, it's not particularly very good. So you're going to have to change everything. Okay. The data that you've got, it's not really much different than the other product. Oh, well, what's the other product? Well, it's vancomycin. This is for MRSA infections. So serious infections in hospital. So the data here was not really much different because of the design of the clinical trial than a 40-year-old product. The 40-year-old product is going to be about 20 times, 30 times cheaper than our product. So we had to try and find a way to communicate this brand in a relevant, authentic, in a meaningful, in a differentiated way. And by various techniques and things that we did, we found a way, and we found certain places where we could work on it. It eventually came out that when we really looked at the people and the patients in this side, weren't really not so important, but because they're very sick patients, it's really all to do with the physician and the time that the physician has to do something in. And the physicians didn't articulate it in this way, but we found that they had a dilemma. And when we started to find words around the choices that they had to make and the time space that they had to make a decision for a life-saving treatment, we found that as we started to articulate around the dilemma and tell stories about, and by stories I mean conversations, sentences, things that they could remember around the dilemma that they had, we evoked emotion. And as we evoked emotion, we could really start to get some traction and engagement with our brand. So when we started to tell them the facts of the brand, that didn't help. When we started to try and understand the emotion of the brand, the relevance to the treating physician at that time, the things that were going through his mind, the things that he was trying to achieve, we certainly found, and unexpectedly found, an area where we could target the brand and all the things that we did, whether it was digital, whether it was print, whether it was spoken, all of those things became around this one central brand moment. We found a brand moment, and that was unusual for us. A brand moment that went across boundaries. So we talked a lot about geographic boundaries. Okay, this transcended geographic boundaries. General physicians understood this moment. This moment started off, and I won't go through the whole story, it started off by telling another story about Friday night. A Friday night when a patient turns up on a trolley, he's got septicemia, you've got to do something very quickly, you're going off duty, because it's Friday night when everyone comes in, which you found was another story for the physicians in the room. Friday night, the worst time for everyone to come in, because you've got to think about giving them an antibiotic and worrying about them over the weekend. And for those of you who don't know, antibiotics are prescribed without really knowing what's going on. So you have to work out what to do very quickly without any evidence or diagnostics. So we found a very good way of selling Cubicin. More importantly, by keeping it consistent across platforms and allowing people to engage around this dilemma, we'd found a story that allowed them to tell everyone else about Cubicin and why Cubicin was a great product to prescribe in that situation, that one specific situation that helped us define and get through the issues of reimbursement, to get through the issues of pricing, get through the issues of 40 years of experience with another product. I think those of you that are medics, the first serious antibiotic you gave in a hospital setting was probably vancomycin. So getting past that whole heritage it was a huge worry for us, but we've managed to do it. And you look at the market, the only analytic I will give you is that, at least in the European market and certainly in the US, the traction rate and brand understanding about what we were trying to achieve when we measured it was extremely high. Good penetration very quickly. It's just one example. So storytelling is really about creating long-lasting meaning, understanding, and relevance. That's the real crux of it. It's what we're trying to get across. We're trying to get across that moment when people just get the brand. And as soon as they've got that moment, then they can run with it. So it's all laser time focused, trying to get down to that side. I mean, those of you that are thinking about stories and maybe worried about, we're trying to manipulate people with stories. It's not really what we're trying to do. We're trying to find the relevance and the moment. And stories, I think, are the long-forgotten means of communication. Started off in cave paintings, as you've got here in France and other places around the world. And funnily enough, they all started roughly at the same time without any digital media or social platforms or anything else floating around them. People started to communicate even before that they could speak with language, with pictures, with movement, with dance, with rhythm, with singing, and then speech, and then written, then books, and then as we're going off and on into the digital platform. So this is inherent in our DNA. It's probably so inherent that as we think about stories, people say that there's only 7 stories that exist. And everything fundamentally results around those. And they're so well known that everyone gets a story. So I don't know how many people have children here. I've certainly got two young children. And to tell another story, maybe you think about this. When you start to read a book to, sorry, go back to the sushi in a second. When you tell a child a story, and you're late back from work, and you're sitting on the bed, and you're reading a story, and you're nodding off, people know that, and you miss a couple of words. You know, and George is my son, he says, Dad, 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 you missed the word out. It's like, he can't even read yet. It's like, okay, how do they know that? Okay, so they've memorized it. But more importantly, why do they want the same story all the time? It's because people like stories where they know the end of. And when you tell stories that, you know, if you're a film producer, you often, if you want mass market films, you want to tell a story that's based on one of these great big archetypical stories. Let's take Star Wars. Star Wars is a fantastic movie. It's based on stories that people know. It's the hero's journey. We're going to talk about archetypes in a bit. People know that story because it's been told. It's the Iliad, it's Homer, it's Jason the Argonaut, it's right the way through to Raiders of the Lost Ark into Star Wars. So this is a well-known story. Everyone knows the ending, but everyone's intrigued to know how it works out. We know what's happened, but we're just compelled to listen to the story. So this is the power of stories. They're ingrained inside us, and there's a couple of people that are involved in neurobiology in here, and to go into that level of detail, every time we hear these stories, we activate emotions. As we activate those emotions, they give us that pleasure reward feedback. The same thing that brands do. The more often we get the right story, consistent story with our brands, we get engrams, and then as we activate those again, we get those emotions come back to us. So we get the story played back to us, which is obviously the key part. I put this up. You've probably heard this before, but this is one of the key defining things that I heard about, I thought about, felt about Pharma as we wanted to change what we did as marketeers. This is probably good after lunch, but when we look at sushi, if Pharma were to invent sushi, then this is how it would sell it. It's true, isn't it? Attribute, 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 attribute. That's not sushi. Nor are our products. Sushi's got visual, it's got volume inside it, it's got nothing to do with the physical attributes of salmon. Now, I know we have to sell in a scientific way and we have to prove by evidence, and that's completely given. But it doesn't mean to say we have to leave all of the other side of our brain out of things. You have to engage both of those things. If I tried to sell you cold raw dead fish, you wouldn't buy it, I would be a dead marketeer. If I tried to sell you sushi, at least half of the room, especially in Boston, would probably buy it. So as we're going through, the biggest thing, of course, and I don't think this is a revelation to people, it's not about us. It's not about my story. It's about patient's story. It's about the physician's story. It's about the insurer's story. And these stories may be different, but they may circulate around the same brand moment. We have to find a way to tell those stories. And they're not complicated. They just require some digging, some inquisitiveness, and to go a little bit further than we've probably thought about, and maybe to change the way that we communicate. Which is why I was very grateful for the organizers to invite me here, because I think if there's any catalyst group inside Pharma at the minute, it's probably going to be the people in this room in terms of the ability to be able to tell stories in different ways. So here's a kind of a thinking map that I put together. Again, this is on the blog site, so you can find it later on. We heard about Maslow earlier on, where the gentleman is in the room. But I think in terms of hierarchy of needs, and I'm going to show a slide on this later on, we talk a lot about attitude and behavior, and they do really fit inside this hierarchy of needs. Other people call it need state, and how they relate together. We've got to think about both the facts and the emotion. When we think about things that we want to do in all the things we've talked about, and as a marketeer, fundamental to me, I'm talking about motion. And emotion the root of that is going to be motion as well. It's from move. So emotion is move. And so we've got to be able to tell both facts and stories. We've got to be able to bring the relevance of the facts with something that's going to move people. Anything with emotion should have physical reaction to it. You should be able to pick up something that makes you do something differently. And as you go across, okay, so lots of us that work in marketing look for insights. We scratch the surface and we find things. You can call them the aha moments when it's like that's something different. But I think you've got to go deeper. And the other parts I want to talk to you today about storytelling will talk about metaphors, archetypes, story arcs, and then getting down to what some groups have been calling deep metaphors, things that are universal ways that we understand our conceptual system, the way that we make relevance from one thing to another thing. And that's essential for us as we introduce new conversations to doctors, that they can make the appropriate relevant steps. Metaphors and deep metaphors are a very good way of doing that. If you have the chance to work with the Olson-Zoltman group in New York, ZMET research is fantastic. It's very illuminating, very enlightening. There's a couple of books that you can find on the website that talk about that in detail. I'm not going to talk too much about their stuff today. Oops. So let's give you a little bit of another way of thinking about storytelling. I've called it the Brand Storytelling Manifesto. It was really just to try and help people understand, help me understand, the sorts of things that build great stories and help create brand moments. So we talked about left brain and right brain tactics. So we've got to be able to pulse these different facts and then emotional stories, making them relevant. They've got to cycle around each other. One supports the other. So do your campaigns have both of those elements inside it? If they're dominant on one and very light on the other, you're likely to miss some tricks. Hierarchy of needs. These go from the basic physical pieces. The next slide is going to talk in more detail about this, to more self-actualization. And we heard this morning a perfect example of that, perfect moment for patients, physicians, ourselves. When we get closer towards self-actualization, we're much more engaged. But also fundamentally, we have to be able to deal with some of the baseline parts of our hierarchy of needs, and those are very much the physical elements. And of course, for pharma, dealing with the physical elements is a big part of our business. So metaphors and archetypes, these are really a way of helping us think about relationships. So metaphors, again, when we think about the words that people use, we spend actually quite a lot of time in Novartis looking at metaphors now, really trying to understand what the real meaning of conversations are. I think when you do market research or you do the listening parts of the social media that you've been talking about today, you'll hear a lot of words. I think as an Englishman, I generally use about 3 or 4 metaphors a minute. I think we all use those and we don't know them. And I think now I've told you that, you'll probably start to hear us do that. And you have to think why. Why are we using metaphors without even knowing them? How do we make a relationship from A to B? And the best way I can explain that is it's probably the first thing we do in our human existence. So as soon as you come out of the womb and you're put on to your mother, you start to make a relationship, you start to make an understanding of warmth and comfort. It's not a spoken word, but it's a feeling, warmth and comfort. And I think it's really interesting that when I meet someone and I shake his hand, and I say, Christopher greeted me warmly. That's a word that we use in language. That metaphor comes from one of those first interactions that we have. And actually after that first interaction with people, then we start to make relevance from one thing to another thing. And as we grow older and we get more experiences, which multiply, and as you think about the experiences that we now have, where we're getting thousands of experiences a day, those ones that are relevant are the ones that we understand and we can make a reference to. but we're also understanding whether they're relevant by the things that are inside us and the things that we do. So metaphors are a fantastic way of really deeply understanding people's meaning and the reasons why they do or don't do things. And I think if you really understand those things, you can really talk to them in a different way. And small little things, small little words like metaphors can really help you unlock conversations that may be difficult to get to in any other way. So that word dilemma was a metaphor for the decision, the whole decision, the complicated decision-making process for the doctor in that moment. Just by activating that word, we could help him understand the choices that that doctor had to make, and then the consequence of the decisions that were made after that. And archetypes, again, we've got a couple of slides on this. Archetypes are really the characterization. Again, when you go back to the fundamentals of things that we understand, there are these really fundamental journeys that people go on. Archetypes are those classical ones that we all understand who they are. When we talk about the hero, we all understand who a hero is. We understand who the sage is. And again, going back to Star Wars, when you go to Star Wars, actually George Lucas employed Joseph Campbell, who's one of the modern fathers of archetypes, to build characters off fundamental, well-understood archetypes. And it's well known that those archetypes are embedded inside us, and they're a way that everyone understands those characters. Building those characters and that archetypal character into your communications, again, is another way of helping people understand what you mean in a much quicker way. So when we talk about hero, you all know what that hero does, how it's going to work, and you can impute those personalities both onto brands and communications. So I'm going to go through these quickly because there are a couple of more slides I want to get to at the end. So of course, persuasion, motivation, enthusiasm, they're things that we have to build in. And then evidence-based, so it's right in the middle. It's to anchor us back to, it's to anchor us back to the point where we can't just tell stories, but we have to have evidence-based stories. They've got to be based back in the facts. They've got to have cement in them. They've got to have foundations in them. Choosing your point of view, the way that you tell the story, from which angle you tell the story. Are we telling a story from a patient's view, or from a physician's view, or from a carer's view, or from my view? Choosing that point of view really changes the story and how it's picked up. You have to choose that view very carefully. It means different. You have to test it in different ways. Word of mouth advertising, so engaging a story. If you can make a story memorable and understanding, then it's going to have more impact. So you've got to think about, is this going to be transmittable? Can people communicate the story and tell it without you being there? Again, it's not about us, and we have to let go. So are you willing with the story to let the person who you want that story to be relevant to create that story? If you're willing to do that, then you're going to have to be open with your branding and your communication. And that's very difficult for us to do. But you can start to see that in some companies' work. And authenticity and having beyond the brand strategy, I think we obviously have to be authentic. That means consistently across everything. We have to act, and live the way that we're telling that story. If we have that moment, everything has to be, let's say for Cubisin, has to be around that dilemma time. So I've got a couple of slides left. So for those of you who haven't been exposed to Maslow, this is a laddering of hierarchy of needs. You can see them inside here and again on the website. And we do spend a lot of time thinking about really the physiological side or even the safety side. This is pharmaceutical safe land for us, because this is all our Cold War dead fish type of work. But I would ask you to think about how your brands relate to the rest of that ladder. And if they're really only at the bottom, then I think in terms of motivation, which this chart really plots, the higher up you go, the more motivating your communications are, the better your story will be understood and retold. If your story is all about the bottom pillar, it's not going to be retold very well. I know I've got 1 or 2 minutes left. I think I've spoken about metaphors, but I want to give you a couple, at least from my experience. I'm just going to flash these up and let you read them. And I think you'll be able to spot the metaphors inside them, and then that will tell you how maybe we started to work through some of these. The last one, I think, for me is especially emotional. This was an MS patient who was presenting to us. It was a stage with 200 or 300 people, and she's a young, articulate woman, and was telling us about her journey with MS. And this was something that I wrote down. She thought that she was unstoppable, a bit like the Titanic. So you got to that moment, she thought she was unstoppable, but like the Titanic, she found she was very fallible. And obviously her life with MS changed everything that came on from the time that she was diagnosed. So again, we talked a little bit about archetypes. I'll give you some of these archetypes. It's really fascinating looking at these and how you can build these into your stories. How you can orientate both a brand, these can be people, these can be corporations too. You can use these at any level to tell stories about brand, about you, about your company, the reason why you're being there. And they help you have a well-known, understandable story. Those stories come with a story arc, and I think it's worthwhile knowing about the journey, because those journeys, again, people are very well ingrained in people's mindsets. And I'll give you maybe another slide later on that helps picture that. So on the last couple of slides then, for me, my journey is about creating fans, not customers. Customers are the people that aren't sticky. Customers are the people that we spend a lot of money on to engage. We put a lot of effort, mental effort, but as soon as we're not there, they disappear. What I really want to do is to find fans, fanatics, people that will go beyond the way to reach out and talk about your brand, engage with your brand, engage with you as a company. And I think there are some fundamental pieces that go around that, around resonance, authenticity, persuasion, motivation, and influence. They're the real things that any other fan of sports or any other brand build in. And I don't think as a pharma organization we think about building a fan base. I think fans tell great stories about their favorite brands, and we need to think about how that works. So I think this is almost the last slide. One of the big things that we need to build in our stories is conflict. You think about all the different types of other stories you think about. The story arc builds conflict. And when you analyze good sales calls or prospecting, what we find is those stories that raise conflict, that create tension. So we're not talking about aggression, we're just talking about tension, that push the audience to think about things in a different way, allows the customer at the end to go through this motivation barrier. This is something that we're starting to see. We push people up to this motivation barrier by changing the tension and then allowing the audience to complete the problem that you're setting up by creating tension on their own. Then we seem to have a much, much better effect. So stories that create tension and allow your brand to create the solution seem to have a much better effect than poor conflict stories. So another thing to think about as you build stories in. Varied visual volume just goes back to saying building in stories is not about text. It's about building in volume, rhythm. It's about building in the lights into your brand, so how people engage. So it's a sensory thing that you have to do in terms of telling stories. And that's well known as you go through the different industries. We think we can pick up a lot more from different industries. How do we build in this varied visual volume into our communications and stories? And so the last slide for me then really talks about transmedia. I think this is where you can come in, and I think this is where it will be a really interesting journey. Trigger finger. Transmedia really is about the difference in the connection between consumers and brands. It used to be obviously very much one-directional, and now consumers are interacting with each other, and brands are interacting with consumers, and it's a completely different cycle. Transmedia is about telling stories where people can insert themselves at different parts in the journey, and that can be through different media. It can be through print, it can be through different digital, it can be through, in other genres, through comic, through games, through many different places. And there's many examples in the digital space that I've started to see, including today, where this is extremely relevant. We can provide that story and provide different ways of people to engage with that story. And it's not always exactly the same story, but taken from slightly different points of view. Then I think we can create great brand meaning and activate, which is, again, the key thing, that brand moment. I think that's the last slide from me. Small, simple stories seem to sell. Should be on there. It's been a journey for us, at least in my thinking, and we've employed it in Novartis, and we're starting to do more. So thank you very much.
Great. Do we have any questions for Mark? We got one over in the corner.